The heavy steel padlock clamped shut against the rusted chain with a sharp, definitive crack. I stood on the cracked asphalt of the loading dock, watching a court-appointed bailiff secure the main gates of Ryder architectural salvage. Beyond the chain-link fence sat 3 acres of history: Victorian fireplace mantels, salvaged stained glass from demolished churches, and pallets of reclaimed Chicago brick, all of it wrapped in the early morning fog. For 14 years I had managed every inch of this yard. Now I was legally barred from stepping within 500 feet of it. Silas stood across the street, his hands buried in the pockets of his cashmere overcoat. He did not look triumphant. He had practiced a look of profound, sorrowful disappointment, playing the role of the responsible older sibling forced to make a tragic decision for the good of the family. He offered a tight, sympathetic nod to the bailiff, then turned and got into the back of a waiting town car. The injunction had been served to me less than 12 hours earlier. The legal document accused me of systemic financial elder abuse. According to Silas, I had spent the last 2 years of our grandmother's life quietly liquidating her estate, forging her signature on wire transfers, and emptying the commercial accounts meant to sustain the salvage yard. He claimed I had hidden the assets in a labyrinth of offshore trusts, leaving the business insolvent upon her death. The paperwork was accompanied by 50 pages of bank logs. Every single unauthorized transfer had been executed from the IP address of my desktop computer in the salvage yard's front office. Silas had positioned himself as the savior, filing an emergency petition to freeze my personal bank accounts, seize control of the property, and prepare it for immediate liquidation to recover the stolen funds. I walked 3 miles in the freezing rain to get back to my apartment, because my debit card had already been declined at the subway terminal. My phone buzzed endlessly with texts from extended cousins, industry contractors, and family friends. Silas had sent a mass email that morning. He had framed it as a necessary plea for transparency, apologizing for the closure of the yard and detailing my supposed crimes with clinical precision. He wrote that he was heartbroken, that he had tried to handle it privately, but the scale of the theft left him no choice. By noon I was a pariah. The suppliers I had worked with for a decade stopped returning my calls. The local historical society, where I volunteered, quietly removed me from their board. The next morning I sat in the cramped, windowless office of Ezra, an independent estate auditor who had done our grandmother's taxes 10 years ago. Ezra was the only person willing to take my meeting, mostly out of a stubborn loyalty to the woman who had built the yard from nothing. He pushed a printout of the bank transfers across his desk. The logs were devastatingly perfect. The dates of the transfers corresponded perfectly with the days I worked late. The routing numbers vanished into shell companies. Silas had built a flawless digital paper trail. Ezra leaned back, rubbing his temples, and told me that unless I could prove someone else had physical access to my computer on those specific dates, I was going to face federal fraud charges. I had no alibi. I practically lived at the yard. But as I stared at the dates on Ezra's printout, a subtle pattern began to emerge. The largest transfers had not happened on random nights. They had happened on the second Tuesday of every month. For the last 2 years, the second Tuesday of the month was the day Silas came to the yard for our traditional family dinner. He would bring takeout from an expensive Italian place, sit at my desk, and complain about the stress of running his boutique investment firm in the city while I organized the warehouse. He had used those dinners, those rare moments of brotherly affection, to access my terminal while I was out in the yard checking inventory. Knowing it and proving it were 2 entirely different things. Silas was a licensed financial advisor. He knew how to move money without leaving a fingerprint. If I went to a judge and claimed my brother used my computer while eating pasta, I would look desperate and guilty. I needed physical proof of what he had actually done with the money, because I knew he hadn't just hoarded it. Silas was notoriously over-leveraged. His lifestyle was a house of cards built on risky margin calls. He needed a massive influx of cash to keep his firm afloat. I needed to see the inventory logs. The salvage yard didn't just sell bricks and lumber. Our grandmother had possessed a private collection of museum-grade architectural antiquities kept in a climate-controlled warehouse at the back of the lot. Original Louis Sullivan ironwork, 18th-century French doors, and hand-carved limestone gargoyles from demolished Gilded Age mansions. pieces worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, to the right private buyers. If Silas was laundering money through my computer, he was likely balancing his firm's books by selling off the yard's most valuable physical assets and framing me for the missing wealth. Because of the court order, I couldn't go near the property. I had to wait for Irene. Irene had been the yard foreman since I was in high school. She was tough, cynical, and fiercely protective of her pension. Silas had temporarily kept her on payroll to manage the liquidation, promising her a massive severance package if she cooperated. I waited for her outside her favorite diner at 6 in the morning, ambushing her before her shift. She tried to walk past me, her eyes fixed on the pavement, muttering that she couldn't risk her retirement for someone who robbed the old lady. I stood in front of her truck, blocking the driver's door. I didn't beg. I told her that Silas wasn't liquidating to pay her a severance. He was liquidating to cover federal wire fraud, and when the FBI finally unraveled the shell companies, the yard would be seized by the government. There would be no pension, no severance, and no jobs for the 12 guys on her crew. I asked her to look at the climate-controlled warehouse. I asked her if the Sullivan Ironwork was still there. Irene stared at me for a long time, the engine of her truck idling loudly in the cold air. She didn't say a word. She just reached into her jacket, pulled out a folded copy of the recent freight manifests, shoved it into my chest, and drove away. Sitting on a park bench, I unfolded the manifests. Irene had highlighted 3 specific shipments handled by a private logistics company called Apex Heritage. The cargo weights were massive, but the manifest listed the items as low-grade scrap metal and reproduction masonry. The dates of the shipments matched the exact weeks Silas had supposedly found massive cash deficits in the accounts. He wasn't just faking the digital transfers. He was physically stealing the museum-grade antiquities, shipping them to private buyers through Apex Heritage, and replacing them with cheap replicas. When the estate was eventually appraised, the appraisers would find the high-value items missing, which would perfectly corroborate his story that I had stripped the business of its wealth. The problem was the security cameras. Silas had told the court that the main office surveillance system had conveniently malfunctioned over a year ago, implying I had disabled it to cover my tracks. The police had checked the digital server in the front office and confirmed the hard drives were wiped. But Silas only knew about the digital system installed in the front office. He didn't know about the analog redundancy. Our grandmother had been deeply paranoid about fires. Years ago, she had hired an electrician to run a closed-circuit line from the loading dock cameras directly down into the basement boiler room, recording onto a continuous loop of industrial magnetic tape. I was the only person who changed those tapes. I had to get into the boiler room. It was a felony violation of the court order, and if I was caught on the property, Silas would have all the leverage he needed to force a plea deal. I waited until 2 in the morning on a Sunday, during a heavy coastal storm. I parked a mile away and walked through the muddy drainage ditch that bordered the back of the property. I scaled the chain-link fence, tearing my jacket and scraping my forearms, and dropped into the yard. The shadows of the stone statues and iron gates looked like distorted figures in the flashing lightning. I moved quietly toward the basement access doors behind the main warehouse. Just as I reached the heavy iron handles, the crunch of tires on gravel froze me. A sleek black SUV pulled into the front gate. The headlights swept across the yard, illuminating the rain. Silas stepped out, holding an umbrella, followed by 2 men in expensive suits. They weren't police. They were private appraisers. Silas was giving a midnight tour to prospective buyers, preparing to sell the remaining land to developers out from under the court's nose. I slipped down the basement stairs, pulling the heavy doors shut just as their voices drifted toward the warehouse. The boiler room was suffocatingly hot and smelled of rust and old oil. I found the metal lockbox bolted to the concrete wall behind the water heater. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the keys twice before finally popping the latch. Inside sat a heavy, dust-covered analog recording deck. I didn't have time to check the tapes. I ejected the 3 most recent master cassettes, shoved them into my waterproof backpack, and climbed out a ventilation window just as I heard Irene's heavy boots descending the basement stairs, likely sent by Silas to check the breakers. It took Ezra 3 days to locate a technician with the obsolete equipment necessary to digitize the magnetic tapes. We sat in a dark editing bay in a strip mall, drinking stale coffee, watching hours of grainy black and white footage of the loading dock. Most of it was just rain, stray cats, and my crew moving pallets of brick. Then we found the timestamp for October 14th, a night the yard was supposed to be closed. A large unmarked freight truck backed up to the loading dock. The camera angle was wide, capturing the entire warehouse entrance. A man stepped out of the shadows, holding a clipboard, directing the movers. It was Silas. He wasn't wearing his cashmere coat. He was wearing a plain jacket, smoking a cigarette, pointing to the specific crates holding the 18th century French doors. The footage clearly showed the movers loading the authentic artifacts into the truck, then unloading identical freshly built crates containing the cheap replicas. He stood directly under the dock lights, his face perfectly visible, signing the Apex Heritage Freight Manifest and handing a thick envelope of cash to the driver. We didn't just have one night, we had six different late-night extractions where Silas personally oversaw the theft of the grandmother's legacy, months before she even passed away. The probate mediation was held 2 weeks later in a glass-walled conference room high above the financial district. Silas sat at the polished mahogany table, flanked by 2 aggressive corporate litigators. He looked immaculate, projecting an aura of weary patience. I sat across from him with Ezra. I didn't have a lawyer. My accounts were still frozen, and no firm would take the case on contingency given the fraudulent bank logs. The mediator, an exhausted retired judge, adjusted his glasses and asked if I was finally ready to accept the settlement. Silas's terms were simple. If I signed over my remaining legal claim to the salvage yard property, he would drop the civil suit and advise the district attorney not to pursue criminal charges. He was offering me my freedom in exchange for the land. Silas leaned forward, folding his hands. He spoke in a soft, patronizing tone, telling me that he didn't want to see me in prison, that our grandmother wouldn't have wanted this, and that it was time to stop fighting and take accountability for my mistakes. I didn't answer him. I opened my laptop, connected it to the large monitor mounted on the conference room wall, and handed the mediator a bound folder containing the Apex Heritage Freight Manifests, the corresponding bank routing numbers from Silas's failing hedge fund, and a certified affidavit from Irene confirming the replicas in the warehouse. Then I pressed play on the digitized video file. The black and white image of the loading dock filled the screen. Silas's lead attorney opened his mouth to object, citing the lack of discovery, but his voice died in his throat as the video clearly showed Silas smoking on the dock, pointing at the crates. The audio was muffled, but distinct enough. You could hear the scrape of the heavy wooden crates, and Silas telling the driver to make sure the French doors didn't get scratched on the way to the private buyer. The reaction was absolute. No one gasped, no one yelled. The corporate litigator next to Silas slowly lowered his pen onto the table, the small click echoing loudly. The mediator stopped turning the pages of the folder and simply stared at the monitor. Silas's face lost all its color, the practiced mask of sorrow instantly vanishing, replaced by a hollow, terrified rigidity. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense negotiation to the suffocating gravity of a crime scene. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning and the mechanical rumble of the freight truck on the video playback. Silas eventually opened his mouth, stammering something about a misunderstanding, about moving inventory for preservation, but his own lawyer held up a hand, effectively silencing him. The lawyer knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at federal wire fraud, interstate theft, and perjury. The attorney slowly closed his briefcase, leaned over, and quietly advised Silas that he was terminating his representation immediately. The fallout was systemic and brutal. The mediator handed the folder directly to the authorities. Silas was indicted less than a month later. His hedge fund collapsed when his investors realized he had been using stolen architectural antiquities to falsely inflate his asset sheets. He tried to contact me twice before his arraignment, leaving voicemails begging for a private conversation, but I never picked up. He had built his own trap, and I let him sit in it. It took me 8 months to untangle the legal mess he had created. I got the yard back, but the damage was profound. The accounts were drained and the best pieces of our grandmother's collection were gone, sold to anonymous buyers who would likely never be tracked down. I had to sell a portion of the empty lot to a developer just to pay the back taxes and keep Irene's crew employed. I was in the warehouse on a quiet Tuesday evening, sweeping the concrete floor. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and old pine. The yard wasn't the empire it used to be. It was smaller, quieter, and scarred by the conflict. I stopped sweeping and looked at a stack of salvaged corbels we had recovered from a local demolition site that morning. They weren't museum grade. They were just honest, solid pieces of history, waiting to be placed somewhere new. I rested the broom against the wall, turned off the overhead lights, and walked out into the yard, locking the heavy steel gates behind me entirely on my own terms. The silence in that mediation room was supposed to be the end of it. When the corporate litigator packed his briefcase and walked out on my brother, I genuinely believed the nightmare was over. I thought the justice system would step in, the stolen assets would be frozen, and the salvage yard would be returned to me by the end of the week. I was naive. The reality of white-collar crime is that the wealthy do not simply surrender when they are caught. They insulate themselves. Silas had spent a decade building financial firewalls, and he wasn't going to let a single grainy basement tape tear down his entire life without a vicious fight. Less than 24 hours after the mediator handed my evidence folder to the district attorney, Silas was arrested at his downtown office. The perp walk was brief, but it made the evening news. However, he was out on bail by midnight. While I was sitting in my apartment, drinking cheap coffee and waiting for a call from the prosecutor, Silas was executing a contingency plan. Before the federal judge could finalize the asset freeze on his hedge fund, Silas's remaining legal team exploited a jurisdictional loophole. They authorized a massive irreversible wire transfer, moving every dime of liquid capital out of his domestic accounts and into an impenetrable trust in the Cayman Islands. He legally bankrupted his own firm overnight to ensure there was nothing left for the state to seize, and more importantly, nothing left to pay back our grandmother's estate. The immediate consequence of his maneuver landed on my doorstep 2 days later. An envelope from the commercial bank holding the salvage yard's mortgage arrived by certified mail. Because Silas had drained the operational accounts and the estate was officially insolvent, the mortgage had gone into default. The bank was initiating an accelerated foreclosure. I had exactly 30 days to produce $400,000 in arrears, or the 3 acres of land, the warehouses, and the remaining inventory would be auctioned off to commercial developers. Silas might have been facing prison time, but he had successfully ensured that I would still lose everything our grandmother had built. I met Ezra and Irene at the diner the next morning. The mood was grim. Ezra reviewed the bank's foreclosure notice, shaking his head. He explained that civil litigation to pierce Silas's offshore trust would take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, money we simply did not have. Irene sat with her arms crossed, staring out the window at the rain. Her crew was already packing up their tools, preparing to look for other work. I refused to accept that it was over. I pulled out the Apex Heritage freight manifests we had used in the mediation. The money was gone, but the physical assets were not. Museum-grade architectural antiquities are not easy to hide. If we could find the 18th century French doors and the Louis Sullivan ironwork, we could petition a judge to grant a writ of replevin, seize the stolen property, and sell it to legitimate buyers to save the yard. The problem was Apex Heritage. It wasn't a real logistics company. Ezra had run the tax ID numbers from the manifests and discovered it was a ghost corporation, registered to a post office box in Delaware. The truck in the video had no license plates, and the driver's signature on the manifest was an illegible scrawl. We had a video of the theft, but no idea where the truck had actually gone after it pulled out of our loading dock. Irene leaned over the table, pulling the grainy printout of the video feed toward her. She pointed a calloused finger at the mud flaps on the rear tires of the truck. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was a faded, half-peeled decal of a bulldog wearing a spiked collar. Irene recognized it immediately. It was the logo for a regional independent trucking syndicate that operated out of a dilapidated depot near the commercial shipping shipyards. These were off-the-books haulers, guys who took cash to move heavy loads without asking questions about manifests or weigh stations. I spent the next 3 days sitting in my car across from the shipyard depot, watching trucks roll in and out through the rusted gates. I was looking for the Bulldog decal. On the afternoon of the 4th day, I saw it. A battered freight truck matching the exact dimensions of the one in the video rumbled into the yard. I waited until the driver climbed out and headed toward a nearby corner store for cigarettes. I intercepted him in the alley beside the store. I didn't threaten him. I didn't have the leverage for that. Instead, I handed him an envelope containing the last $2,000 I had to my name, cash I had borrowed from a friend. I told him I didn't care about the illegal hauling, but I needed the drop-off address for the crates he moved for Silas on October 14th. The driver counted the money, looked around the empty alley, and pulled a small, greasy notebook from his jacket. He flipped through the pages, found the date, and read off an address. It wasn't a commercial warehouse or a private gallery in the city. It was a massive residential estate, situated on a private cliffside overlooking the Hudson River, 3 hours north. I drove up there the following evening. The property was a fortress, surrounded by 12-foot stone walls and wrought-iron security gates. I parked my car half a mile down the winding, heavily wooded road and hiked through the dense forest until I reached the perimeter wall. The trees provided enough cover to obscure me from the security cameras mounted on the stone pillars. I climbed a massive oak tree, whose branches extended over the wall, giving me a clear view of the sprawling grounds. The estate was undergoing massive renovations. Scaffolding covered the entire west wing of the mansion. I pulled out my binoculars and focused on the construction materials staged on the vast manicured lawn. My breath caught in my throat. Leaning against the temporary fencing wrapped in heavy moving blankets were the hand-carved limestone gargoyles our grandmother had salvaged from a demolished bank building in the 90s. Beside them, sitting on heavy wooden pallets, were the custom crates containing the French doors. Silas hadn't just sold the artifacts to a random collector. He had liquidated them to a private developer, outfitting a mega mansion. I climbed down from the tree and hurried back to my car, my mind racing with a plan. I couldn't just call the local police. Without a warrant and definitive proof that the specific items on that lawn were the exact ones stolen from the salvage yard, the local authorities would never breach the gates of a billionaire's estate based on the word of a desperate guy in the woods. I needed undeniable physical evidence connecting those specific architectural pieces to our grandmother's inventory logs, and I needed it before the construction crew permanently installed them into the masonry of the mansion, where they would be legally entangled in real estate law forever. I drove back to the city before sunrise, my mind mapping out the exact bureaucratic leverage I needed. I didn't go to the local police precinct. A patrol officer wouldn't know the difference between a 19th century limestone gargoyle and a modern garden center reproduction, and by the time a detective filed a subpoena for a property search, those artifacts would be cemented into the mansion's facade. I needed someone who cared obsessively about architectural provenance. I met Irene at the diner as it opened. Because Silas was under federal indictment and his assets were frozen, the civil injunction barring me from the salvage yard had been temporarily suspended. I sent Irene into the yard's main office to retrieve our grandmother's leather-bound provenance ledgers. Our grandmother never trusted digital databases for her most valuable acquisitions. She kept meticulous hand-drawn diagrams, macro photographs, and condition reports for every piece of museum-grade salvage she bought. Irene dropped the heavy, dust-covered ledgers onto the diner table. We spent 2 hours carefully matching the inventory numbers to the items I had seen through my binoculars. The 18th century French doors weren't just old wood. They possessed a highly specific, bespoke iron hinge pin, stamped with the initials of a Parisian blacksmith, hidden entirely within the doorframe mortise. The limestone gargoyles had a distinct asymmetrical lead patch, poured into a microfracture on their interior dowel channels, a repair our grandmother had commissioned in the late 90s. These were physical fingerprints. They could not be faked, and they could not be erased without destroying the pieces. With the ledgers in hand, Ezra and I bypassed law enforcement entirely and went straight to the State Historic Preservation Office. We didn't frame it as a simple theft. We framed it as the illegal trafficking of registered historical antiquities across state lines. The Preservation Office wielded a very specific, terrifying kind of bureaucratic power over wealthy developers. If they suspected a construction site was utilizing stolen cultural heritage, they could issue an immediate, indefinite stop work order. For a billionaire hemorrhaging thousands of dollars a day on contractor fees, a stop work order was a death sentence for their renovation timeline. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a state preservation inspector, flanked by 2 county sheriffs, pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of the Cliffside estate. I rode in the back of the inspector's sedan, clutching the provenance ledgers. The estate's site manager, a severe man in a hard hat and a tailored suit, stormed out to meet us, aggressively demanding to see a warrant. The inspector calmly handed him the stop work injunction. The site manager's face tightened as he read the document. He immediately pulled out his phone, barking at his legal team, but he had no choice but to let us onto the grounds. We walked across the manicured lawn toward the construction staging area. The massive limestone gargoyles were still wrapped in moving blankets, sitting exactly where I'd seen them the night before. The estate's lead attorney arrived within 10 minutes, stepping out of a black town car with a folder full of purchase agreements. He confidently declared that his client had bought the masonry legally through Apex Heritage, presenting a forged bill of sale signed by Silas. I didn't argue with him. I simply opened our grandmother's ledger to the diagram of the gargoyles, handed it to the state inspector, and asked him to examine the interior dowel channel of the piece on the left. The site manager reluctantly ordered 2 construction workers to unwrap the heavy stone and tilt it backward. The inspector shined his heavy-duty flashlight into the dark, narrow mounting hole at the base. He went entirely still. He pulled a magnifying glass from his jacket and leaned closer. There, perfectly matching the 30-year-old drawing in the ledger, was the asymmetrical lead patch. We moved to the crates containing the French doors. The inspector requested a pry bar. Over the furious protests of the estate's attorney, the inspector popped the wooden casing off the frame and removed the top hinge. Etched into the rusted iron pin, exactly where the ledger indicated, were the tiny, unmistakable initials of the 18th century blacksmith. The silence that fell over the lawn was absolute. The aggressive posturing of the estate's attorney evaporated instantly. He looked at the forged bill of sale in his hand, then looked at the undeniable physical proof embedded in the stone and iron. He knew immediately that his billionaire client was now in possession of stolen, high-value cultural artifacts, making him an accessory to a federal interstate trafficking ring. The attorney didn't scream or threaten to sue. He made a quiet, calculated business decision. He turned to the sheriffs, formally surrendered the artifacts to state custody, and stated on the record that his client had been thoroughly defrauded by Silas and the broker at Apex Heritage. To protect his employer from a catastrophic public relations scandal, he handed over every piece of correspondence, banking information and shipping logistics they had on Silas. That was the fatal blow. Silas had built a flawless digital fortress to hide the money, but he hadn't accounted for the physical reality of the things he was stealing. The billionaire's legal team ruthlessly threw Silas to the federal prosecutors, providing the exact offshore routing numbers Silas had used to receive the laundered cash from the Apex Heritage Shell Company. It took 3 months for the federal court to unravel the offshore trusts, but the evidence was insurmountable. Silas was forced to take a plea deal for multiple counts of wire fraud, interstate trafficking and perjury. The offshore accounts were seized, and the court ordered immediate restitution to our grandmother's estate. The bank, seeing the federal mandate for restitution and the safe return of the high-value physical assets, immediately halted the foreclosure proceedings on the salvage yard. I didn't attend Silas's sentencing. I had already spent enough of my life watching him perform. He received 46 months in a federal correctional facility. The extended family, who had so eagerly forwarded his initial email condemning me, suddenly tried to call and apologize. I let every single one of their calls go to voicemail. The winter thawed into a wet, heavy spring. The yard survived, though it felt distinctly different. We had to auction off the gargoyles and the French doors legally to replenish the operating accounts and pay Ezra's emergency fees, but the core of the business remained intact. Irene kept her pension, and her crew returned to work, moving pallets of reclaimed brick and salvaged oak under the grey coastal sky. I stood by the loading dock late on a Friday afternoon, holding a clipboard, checking the incoming inventory from a recently demolished theatre downtown. The air smelled of rain and cold iron. I walked over to a heavy pallet of tarnished brass lighting fixtures. They were covered in decades of dust, chipped and neglected, but structurally sound. I ran my thumb over the intricate floral etching on the base of one of the lamps, feeling the weight and the history of it. They just needed time, attention, and a quiet place to be restored. I logged the serial numbers into our grandmother's leather ledger, closed the heavy book, and walked back toward the front office to make a pot of coffee, leaving the past exactly where it belonged.